Good evening, everyone. Oh, let me make sure my full head is properly shown in front of camera. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lily Qi. I'm a state delegate from District 15. I'm proudly showing my district map behind me. It's from Potomac all the way to Poolesville, representing the northern and western part of Montgomery County. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this very timely discussion. We have over 130 people who sign up for tonight's webinar, so hopefully most of them will remember to sign out, and I see that we already have over 80 people, not counting the speakers, so thank you. This is also a very diverse mix of residents from different communities and across Montgomery County, so we all know this is a very important topic. Some of the audiences tonight are very new to this subject of policing and community police. As I mentioned, I represent Montgomery County in the state legislature. The state is also looking into policing and accountability issues. And in fact, House Speaker Adrian Jones has led the initiative to look into several of the immediate measures that we are asking the governor to implement in terms of police reform and accountability. So I'm very honored today to have a great panel of speakers joining us to share timely information and updates on this important subject. But before I start, I want to first thank tonight's event planners and sponsors who have been working with me on this event and on a larger community conversation for weeks now. First, I want to thank the Office of Community Partnerships, including the county's African American liaison, Julianne Normand. Wave, Julianne, thank you so much. And his counterpart, the Asian American Community Liaison, Yi Shen, both from the Office of Community Partnerships, who are co-sponsoring this event. To take a moment to thank other co-sponsors, including Mr. Greg Wims, who represents both the Victims' Rights Foundation and the historical Emery Grove Rotary Club. And Mr. Paul Lee here, who is a great community leader representing both the Asian Pacific Americans Coming Together and the Calvin J. Lee Foundation. Council member of Gaithersburg City, Lorianne Sales, is supposed to join us. Hopefully she will find her way around. She does have a city hearing tonight, so that might be part of the reason she's supposed to make some opening remarks. But you know, whenever she joins, she will have her floor. I also want to thank CCACC and Dr. Chi-Xiang Lee for providing technical support and just being there for us whenever we need your help. And OCADC and other leaders like Paul Zhu and Susan Yu for all of your help and support to make this happen. We are having this conversation because we are at a historical moment that forces us to question many things, including our values, our priorities, and our roles, and the roles of many institutions that we think we know and take for granted, including the police in our communities' lives. This national outrage over the killings of many Black Americans on top of a global pandemic that revealed some deep-seated anti-Asian xenophobia really thrusts both the Black community and the Asian American community into the forefront of national dialogues. And it's really a perfect storm that brings our communities together. To that end, a small group of us started having conversations about inter-community relations, how we can better build trust, and the conversations on an ongoing basis. One of the small first steps we made was to send a letter of support from the Chinese American community, and I know many other communities are doing the similar things, to the Black community to express solidarity and support over Black Lives Matter. And the response was great, and it was really overwhelming. And so tonight's conversation is simply one further step toward that end. We have many members of our community with very little interaction nor understanding with the police and can easily get confused or concerned with calls for defunding the police, for example, because they just don't understand what that means. So I want to start from here. By having a conversation to explain what the calls really mean, asking Councilmember Jawanda and asking our police chief. But before that, I would like to ask Mr. Paul Lee to make some brief remarks. on behalf of our group. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Qi. Thank you for taking the lead to organize this timely and important discussion. I came to the US in 1991. In the first year, I was still in the honeymoon period with my US experience. I saw on the TV news a video footage of the beating of a Black man by the LA police. I was shocked. That was not what I expected to see here in the US. Like many Asian immigrants who grew up in a racially homogeneous society, we cannot fully comprehend racism. We cannot fully understand what many Black Americans experience in a daily basis. Fast forward to 2016, the election of President Obama gave me hope that our country has finally overcome racism and moved to a colorblind, post-racial society. But what happened recently pulled me back to the reality. The reality is that racism, overt or subtle, still exists and will probably exist as long as we are humans. That's why we need to recognize Black Lives Matter. Only when Black lives matter that all lives truly matter. It is our moral responsibility to treat each other with respect and dignity that all God's children deserve. We Asian Americans stand shoulder to shoulder with our Black brothers and sisters to fight against racism. From 1991, the beating of Rodney King, to 2020, the death of George Floyd, almost 30 years have passed. It seems that nothing has changed in terms of police treatment of Black people and other minorities. What reform we need to bring real change? How can we restore the community trust of the police force that is supposed to protect us, not terrorize us? In Montgomery County, we're really blessed with such a racially diverse community where people treat each other with respect and love. I've gone to a few local rallies supporting Black Lives Matter. I personally witnessed people from all backgrounds, including police officers, coming together supporting Black Lives Matter. I think we all want to change, our community members and our police. The question is how? Let me be honest, the term defunding the police has caused some confusion and concern in the community. That's why tonight's dialogue is so valuable and important. Let's demystify this whole concept. I really look forward to hearing from our council member Mr. Jawanda, our Police Chief Jones, and from other community members, Mr. Elijah Wheeler and Mrs. Ariana On. Back to you, Delegate Qi.
Thank you, Paul, for your great leadership in our community on many fronts, and especially in the course of this important conversation, a cross-cultural conversation. So as Paul mentioned, besides our council member and the police chief, we also have two community leaders joining us for this conversation, Mr. Elijah Wheeler, who is the executive director of the Montgomery County Collaboration Council for Children, Youth, and Families, as well as Ariane Ah, who's my good friend and a civil rights attorney and activist. I will ask them to chime in and provide their perspectives as well. So let me start with Councilmember Jawanda. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're extremely busy. You need to unmute yourself, or somebody needs to unmute you, please. We want to hear your voice. Thank you.
Here we go. I'm here.
Councilmember Jawanda, you have been on the forefront of pushing for police reform and accountability even before the national outrage on police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement. And you have written two op-ed pieces in the Washington Post between last year and this year related to this subject, and have publicly been supportive of the call for defunding the police. Let me start with you by asking, what exactly do you mean when you say defunding the police?
Sure. Thank you, Delegate Qi. It's great to be here, and thank you to Paul and all the fellow speakers. The chief and I have been on probably 20 of these calls with each other, and so we're very used to this. And of course, Elijah and Julian and Ariana. It's great to be with everybody. And thank you for convening this discussion. So to me, and the piece I wrote in the Washington Post, one was actually a story that was written about me. The other was a op-ed I wrote. I said that defunding to me means reimagining public safety. It means a total kind of sea change in how we view the role of police in our public safety system. And I think in order to understand why that's important, and that certainly will necessitate reallocation of resources, which is a key part of when most people say defund, what they mean, removing money from the police budget and putting it to social services, HHS, other types of services that will limit the need for police interaction. I'll let the chief speak for himself, but you ask most police officers that I've talked to if they want to be interacting with people who are dealing with mental health crises or experiencing homelessness, for example, they will say, no, that's not our function. But because of what we've chose to budget and pay for and ignore, in the case of mental health, for example, many of our police interactions are dealing with people with mental health issues. And there are models out there where you don't have to have that happen. For example. And so it would make sense that if you would invest in those programs and have a non-police response in a number of cases that they are currently responding to, that you could theoretically reduce the amount of funding and or need for armed officer presence if that burden is being shifted. And so that's part of the conversation. But I often say that, our police budget is a little over $280 million if in Montgomery County. If you add the sheriff's department and other entities, it's higher in local police departments. If you were to take all that money and immediately zero it out and shift it somewhere else, you wouldn't be able to solve all the other issues that we have. Now, does that mean we shouldn't shift any money? Of course not, we should. And I think there are some ways in which police presence can escalate a situation and not be helpful. But the answer includes reallocation or defunding, but that is not the complete solution. So I'm comfortable with that term. And I think you have to go back a little further and understand the history and the role and the form and function of policing to get this as well, and who policing has been disproportionately harming in the history of our country. And if you look at the beginning of policing, for example, in the South, it started as slave patrols that had badges that said slave patrol that were used to round up escaped enslaved individuals. And that was the earliest functions of police in the formation. And then post-Reconstruction, after the Civil War, you had police and politicians and groups that sought to bring harm to communities of color be working together. And you had many politicians say, well, at least we have the police to keep the Black folks that are now no longer enslaved in line. And you had state-sanctioned terrorism by law enforcement. And that's the history of policing. And that has continued. And, Mr. Paul mentioned the 91 Rodney King, beating, where people were acquitted. And, that at that time, you had just had the first Black police chief elected, put forward in the country, who was in LA at the time. And there hadn't been one prior to 1988. You had your first Black police officer in 1911 in the city of New York. And so you have to understand the history of policing and where it came from and how it's disproportionately been used as a form of violence against Black people. And the last thing I'll say, because I don't know how long, I don't want to go too long, is those vestiges are still present today. If you look at who's incarcerated, the failed war on drugs, the system of mass incarceration that has a direct line from slavery to who is locked up now. The big loophole in the 13th Amendment, that all people must be free except for those who are incarcerated. to paraphrase the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. That process has disproportionately harmed Black people and people of color. And Montgomery County is not immune to that. And we can probably talk more about this later, but half of the people arrested in 2018 in Montgomery County were Black. 55% of the people who had force used against them in an interaction with law enforcement were Black. That is disproportionate and similar, even though Black folks represent about 19 to 20% of the population in the county. So we have to ask those questions and understand that history if you're going to change and limit the interactions that Black people, people of color are having with law enforcement. So that's what defund means to me, is as you rethink the whole system, how do you reallocate and get police focused on violent crime, on interactions that are most important, and minimize the need for interactions that we know over time and currently have disproportionately impacted certain members of our community.
Thank you, Council Member, for your thorough explanation. I think what you are really saying is what you mean by defunding police is really reimagining police and reshifting priorities to make sure we have a holistic approach in serving the communities and not just focusing on the enforcement part of law enforcement. So let me shift to Chief Marcus Jones. It seems like even though you have been a fairly new police chief, and congratulations again, you have been with the Montgomery County Police Department forever, right? Like you grew up there or something practically. So you know how the department has evolved over the years, and including how it has taken on its own police reform measures. But with this renewed demand for accountability, please, share with us some of the new measures you are instituting, and also, do you agree with Councilmember Jawanda in his take in terms of what defunding police really means? What does that mean to you?
Okay. All right. So good evening to everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. And thank you to Delegate Qi and the many sponsors and my fellow panelists that are here today, and the folks who have joined us. It's my pleasure to be with you this evening. In police reform, and again, when we look at policing across America, I think, people have to look at things look at it in a way that we have to understand policing all across this country. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States of America. And Montgomery County Police, which has been here for nearly 100 years, has been through some major challenges over the course of our time, and with that being said, I think that, again, at the end of the day, when we see what has happened across America, the things that we've encountered over the course of our, in our profession and across the years, I've been here for 34 years, policing, there's always a challenge for policing to change along with the times and to really work as partners with our community so that we understand as community, we are in this together in order to make it for a safer community. One of the things that I think is most important for people to understand is that Montgomery County Police has always been dedicated to having and maintaining a low crime rate here in the county. And I think we are, particularly in this area, we are one of the lowest crime areas in this region. And as we move forward with this, as we talk about Black Lives Matter, I've been an advocate for the Black community in my 34-year career from really the day that I arrived here. And I've done a lot of work across the national level and have understood the impact of policing in our communities and have worked with communities in order to bridge the gap. And I have an extensive record for that. In order to really kind of help to guide my police department. That's one of the things that has really kind of helped me to guide. So with that being said, as we look at what does reimagining policing, and County Executive Markey Ulrich has set out a plan to look at some of the things that Mr. Jawanda spoke about in regards to giving police the ability to not necessarily be the last stop for everyone for services, to be able to handle everything that comes down the pike. Of course, with 911 and our telephones, we are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there are things that sometimes we get tasked with doing that is technically not a police function. And so what are we trying to look at? Is we are trying to look at those functions that don't need the police, that we shouldn't be involved in particularly in some of our communities. And one of those top things that we somehow get involved in is the mental health world. And there is a significant impact in the mental health community that we've had over the past 20 plus years, that that the federal government has put less money, and some state and local governments have put less money towards mental health in the mental health behavior field, and we as the police department has been responsible for having to try to resolve these issues and this to become the panacea, and that's not the case. So with that being said, we are committed to actually taking some of those things off of our plate in order for us to be able to have a better functioning police department, to work with other issues with community engagement, doing more things that are active. I would suggest that we do a pretty good job currently of solving crimes and keeping our crime rate low. I think, again, we will always have that mission. But the one thing, as Mr. Jawanda has noted in his response to defunding, let me just be very clear. 80% of my budget technically goes to salaries and benefits for my 1,300 person department, police department, as well as my 600 plus civilian staff that work for the police department, who do a lot of work behind the scenes. And let me also note that as we talk about taking money from our police department and giving it to other agencies, I think that's a slippery slope, because when you start taking money away, we might change our function, but now you are taking away opportunities for additional training. You are really taking away, when you want to have the best trained police department that's out here, we have to invest in training. We really need a larger training budget, to be honest with you. And so with all those these things, that when we talk about operating costs, that's important. The other thing that I would also note that needs to be made, that really we need to understand is that Montgomery County Police, we have 1,300 officers and we have 1.1 million residents that reside here in Montgomery County. In Prince George's County, for example, they have less than 1 million people, I think somewhere around 800,000, but yet they have close to 1,700 police officers. Baltimore County has about 1,800 police officers, and they somewhere around the 700 to 800,000 population. So therefore, we have fewer officers per capita. We are one of the lowest per capita rates of police officers to our community. And so that means something when we talk about really taking away and defunding, because when we look at what are we defunding, a lot of what we're defunding is positions. Because we're taking away certain positions from our folks, people who work here in the county, who work very hard to make Montgomery County a better place. So I really wanted to stress that the fact that we always want to look at and evaluate how we spend our monies. But again, Montgomery County has very high standards. We went to the body-worn camera about 4 or 5 years ago. That is very expensive to run that program. Police departments will tell you a lot of them don't want to run the program because of the high rate of cost. So these are just a few examples that I'll share. But again, when we talk about working with our community, particularly communities of color, African American community, yeah, we have a lot of work to do when we say we want to be able to earn more of the community's trust. We do. We're working hard to do that in community engagement. But at the end of the day, we have to be partners. People have to come to the table and have a discussion. and we have to listen to one another, and we have to, you know, and that's an important piece. It's one thing to talk, but it's another thing to listen. And one of the things that I've stressed with the police department is for us to be able to listen to our, listen to our community, and to make sure that we are hearing what are their needs. And I know Mr. Jawanda has put out some statistics, and he notes about the amount of African Americans that are impacted. But the one thing I'll also share that I think, again, must be emphasized, that in Montgomery County, though the doors don't close, we have quite a few people from across other jurisdictions that come here and commit crime as well. And those numbers are also included, unfortunately, in our numbers of arrests. You know, and we have victims who are victims of crime. And those victims are those who point out the individuals that actually commit those crimes. And I think that's important for people to understand the full picture of this, is that policing, we are working to help communities, people who are sometimes victimized by crime in many of our communities. And sometimes those communities, again, that we understand that might need us the most, but they trust us the least because we have to do a better job of establishing relationships. So I'll just stop there because I know there's more questions that other people have to get to. So thank you.
Thank you both, Chief Jones and Council Member Jawanda, for your very thorough your positions on this issue that have created some confusion and some controversy. So thank you for taking the time to explain your position. So Chief Jones, from what I heard from you, you support Councilmember Jawanda's position that certain functions like mental health related issues does not have to be the core of police response. However, you are arguing that we should not take away funding from the needed training and personnel because they do important work. And in comparison, Montgomery County is modest in our size of workforce in the police department, right?
Yes,
so I want to, I'm sorry, yeah. Let me get back to you on this because we have many other related questions. And if I could just explain the flow of the rest of the program, we received about 40 some questions ahead of time, okay, which is enormous. And I took some time and tried to group them and want to make sure we have some time to, hopefully enough time to ask all of these subjects, go through them first. And then if we have a few minutes left, we can go over the questions submitted through the chat room and you know, answer as much as we can. At this point, I would like to ask our community leaders to weigh in on this issue. Elijah, I'm gonna start with you. Could you unmute yourself, please? You have heard both the police chief and the council member. What is your take on this? Because you both represent, you are the co-chair of the Montgomery County African American Advisory Group. Of course, what that means is you influence policies of the county executive and administration, and you are the executive director of Collaboration Council, which it means you see things at the forefront of the impact of our policies and investments on families. So please.
Sure. I appreciate it, Delegate Qi. I thank you for having me here this evening. To fellow panelists, glad to be here with you all to have the opportunity to engage in such a discussion. I think the framework of the conversation should really be around the call that Councilman Jawanda was making is really in relationship to the adverse relationship between the Black community specifically and law enforcement. Historically, it's not unique to Montgomery County. Obviously, it's an issue that we all are very well of, especially for those of us who happen to be Black. I appreciate Paul earlier with his framework around Rodney King in '91. I remember that happening like it was yesterday in middle school and seeing that. But what sticks out of my mind a little bit more than that is the fact that I remember having a conversation with my parents when I was in elementary school that we refer to as the talk in Black families around how I should comport myself when I interact with law enforcement. At a very early age, having this conversation with my parents to ensure that my safety was paramount because of the adverse situations and relationships between law enforcement and Black communities specifically. The reason we're here today, obviously, is because of people like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Atiana Jefferson, and others whose names are countless at this point in time. Something needs to be done. I think when we're talking about defunding police, The phrase at this point in time might be a little misleading for some folks, because I think that people automatically jump to the thought that we're not going to have law enforcement in communities at all. That's not what the call is for. It's around what was framed earlier, which is really addressing these things that a lot of times law enforcement is brought into unnecessarily speaking, whether it be trying to attend to people's mental health needs, issues of homelessness, and other things. Making sure that we have services in place so that law enforcement is not necessarily being brought into these conversations or these interactions with people unnecessarily speaking. So I think that has to be the framework with this. I also appreciate the chief's point earlier around Montgomery County and him having 1,300 law enforcement officers here. I think one thing that we also have to point out too, in a county of 1.1 million roughly, is that Montgomery County Police are not the only law enforcement agency that have jurisdiction here in Montgomery County. There are a number of other law enforcement agencies as well here too, whether it be City of Gaithersburg, Rockville, Park Police, the Sheriff's Department. We have a number of law enforcement agencies here in Montgomery County that we also have to be reminded of have jurisdiction and have the right at any point in time to stop someone and have an interaction with them. I think it's uniquely important at this point in time that we listen to people in the community. We talk to people about their interactions with law enforcement and do something to address those things. Obviously, there's a lot of respect and a great deal of respect for our law enforcement officers who go out each and every day and have some very tough jobs. There's no doubt about that. And once again, the Black community does not want to completely get rid of law enforcement. But what the Black community also does not want to have is to be treated as suspects in their own neighborhoods when they're coming and going. I think there's a clear distinction here when we start having these discussions. So as we're thinking about this a little bit further, and as Councilman is kind of helping to shepherd this work, I think we need to look at the whole picture and really understand that the investments that we make should be to make sure that people have their safety and also their needs met at the very same time, which are some things that we should not be expecting for law enforcement to handle or to do.
Thank you, Elijah. I'm going to turn to Ariane to chime in here on this important topic.
Okay, thank you, Lily. Hello, everyone, and I want to thank our organizers and also welcome the other panelists. So I'm a former civil rights attorney and an activist, and I came into the work to address hate incidents against Asian Americans in the past few months, especially with the advent of COVID-19. They've spiked now to about 2,100, 2,300 anti-Asian incidents around the country. So I wanted to thank Chief Jones and the Community Engagement Officer for coming to speak and address the Asian American community during, I think it was last month, where there was really peak concerns that might spill over into the county, but fortunately they have not. Those cases are very far and few between. But I'd like to speak to police reform generally and around the country. And as a civil rights attorney, I welcome this conversation. I think it's inspired some deep and broad conversations about reimagining public safety. And I really hear my fellow activists around the country when they say that there's change that needs to be undertaken because the past efforts for reforms have just not led to the improvements in the relationships with the community members. I know that there is a significant number of first-generation immigrants who are in the audience, and they might ask, why should Asian Americans be concerned with police misconduct and accountability? The relationships in the home countries may be different, and also having lived here, the interactions might be few and far between. In fact, I think I looked once at the numbers of the 911 calls in the county, and it was 0. So I'm not sure whether that's because we haven't come into knowledge about when and how to contact the police, and also what happens during those encounters if there are issues, whether they're being reported. But I want to say sort of 3 things. And number 1, police agencies serve the public. So we want the police to serve, to treat people the same, whether it's their skin color or their wealth or their neighborhood. And more relevant, excuse me, to Asian immigrants, that falls onto language. So, over time, in the waves of immigration, when Asian immigrants, came to the country, I mean, I've heard stories where, when limited English proficient people were just lost in the street, they would be locked up, in jail. Or if there was a conflict and the officers came on the scene, then they didn't know who to hold blameworthy. So, that they spirited people away into jail, and the Asian person wouldn't be able to defend themselves because they couldn't speak English. Fortunately, that did not occur here or in recent times, but that's just to say that, those are some of the issues that were faced in the past. Second, similar to all government agencies, businesses, organizations, police agencies that are subject to independent oversight and held accountable for police misconduct evoke more public confidence. And so while the numbers of Asian Americans that have been killed in police shootings are relatively low, they exist. And I will post some stats on police killings that involve Blacks and also that involve, Asians. We talked a lot today about, the mental health cases. I did a police ride-along in District 1, and the officer that I was in with said that maybe 20% of the cases that he encountered deal with mental health. And I'm going to give you an anecdote which kind of echoes some of the things that we've heard in the news nationally. So in 2015 in Long Beach, California, there was a Filipino American, Marlon Secon, who was 39, and he had some mental health challenges, and he was sitting in an arcade, but he had a knife with him, and the staff knew that he had mental health challenges, and all they needed to do was to get him to exit that arcade. And so the officers came, and while the family claims that the video shows that he never challenged or threatened the officers, but at the end of the day, Mr. Secon was shot 8 times and died. So I think what this anecdote speaks to is that the conversation, whether it's defunding police, the overall conversation about, how can the police and community communicate in a way to bring transformation so that the agencies reflect the needs of the community and serve the community in a way that they feel protected and not antagonized is worthwhile. We also experienced police misconduct. So around the same year in Huntsville, Alabama, there was a senior citizen who had just come from India to visit his family. And within days, he was sort of walking around his house, peeked in the window at the neighbor next door, and that triggered the police to come. We've all seen during the George Floyd protests, there was a white senior citizen who was knocked down, and there was a shot of him with his head cracked open, bleeding on the sidewalk. Well, the same thing happened to this gentleman. So this grandfather ended up, he was pushed unprovoked. He just couldn't understand the commands, was shuffling around, and he fell over, hit his head on a sidewalk, and ended up in the hospital with surgery for spinal injuries. And the acting chief in that office did not find a policy violation, and that officer was back on the force after administrative leave. So that again speaks to the interest, I think, in everyone to have these conversations about accountability. Lily had invited me to talk about my reaction about these reform movements, and I actually focus more on the balance of national security and civil rights. And the Black Lives Movement has inspired conversations at the federal government level. And sort of what's more pertinent right now, especially to Chinese American immigrants, is that they're being viewed as spies because of the heightened US-China tensions. And so, I can draw parallels in the profiling concerns. So instead of being stopped because you're driving black in a car, activists has talked about, being investigated as spies when you're in the lab. You know, instead of the highway I-95, you know, getting stopped, you're investigated for connections to China, like flights to China. So, I mean, the parallels aren't perfect. There are differences. There are concerns outside of just solely race, ethnicity, and national origin. But what that does is that it speaks to the need for institutional reform for national security agencies to be inclusive of the community, and because they're mostly white, and you know, they look upon suspicion of the minority groups without consulting them about, you know, why it is that they're going to China. I mean, if 2/3 of Asian Americans are first-generation immigrants, they're going to have business or professional ties to China and go to China. So I think that the same conversations that inspire reforms at a local enforcement agency level actually can make its way into a federal government level. And so it's all very fluid and will sort of inform each other. So I'm very hopeful in that sense. I also want to share with you that, you know, nationally, there are many Asian Black solidarity conversations, and that might not be known here locally or even among the public at large. But I've seen, you know, across all ethnic groups, even down to the Pacific Islanders, very deep, soul-searching conversations. The Koreans, you know, have talked about confronting anti-Blackness in their community. They've tried to trace it to, you know, their understanding of race all the way back to when the U.S. soldiers, you know, arrived in Korea for the Korean War, through the LA riots until now. And, you know, professional groups, Silicon Valley women, entrepreneurs, brand marketers, students are having these conversations. Young people are writing letters to their parents. They're having it translated in every single language to start having the difficult conversations about race. So we are in solidarity, and I just wanted to share that. And so there's a lot of lessons learned too for our local Asian American community who want to get involved. Be happy to share that. You just contact Delegate Qi.
Thank you very much, Ariane, and thank you all for weighing in on this important subject. And she's right that in my own previous capacity working for County Executive Delegate as a political appointee, I worked on a myriad of issues, including community engagement, government cultural competency, and economic development. Government cultural competency is an ongoing journey that takes each and every government official to be very cognizant about the changing community dynamics and the nuances between ethnicities and races. And I'm very pleased that because of these larger happenings and events globally and nationally, that at the local level, that we are seeing a lot more soul-searching, deep, even intra-community conversations across different generations. And that should have taken place a long time ago. But immigrants, by and large, don't identify themselves by race. So anything related to race relations are uncomfortable topics for them. So those of us who are community leaders need to just step up and channel those conversations in a constructive way. So let me move on, because we don't have much time and have a lot of conversations to have. Let me go back to Council Member Jawanda. Could you comment in general as a council member in terms of budgetary allocations for the police department as compared to the county's budget for social services and mental health in general? Because I'm sure you are constantly looking at budget and how to best reallocate and reprioritize, especially now in light of this conversation. And I also want to call out one thing that piqued a lot of people's interest, which is the elimination of a school resource officers program, because a lot of people are confused about that as well. So in general, can you comment on the budget and also specifically to the call for the elimination of that? Thank you.
Sure, just a couple of easy questions there.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'll comment on both of those. I mentioned that, you know, 280+ million budget. 80% is personnel, as the chief mentioned, 1,300 sworn, 600, civilian. And then Mr. Wheeler, who's the director of our Collaboration Council for Children, Youth, and Families, does a great job, mentioned the many other law enforcement agencies we have operating, which augment the numbers. So I think we kind of need to talk about the number a little differently per capita. But then I also mentioned the disparate outcomes, right, that are not unique to Montgomery County, but that are here. Despite our low crime rate, despite declining property theft and violent, and having a relatively low crime rate, what we do see is these disparate statistics for members of our community. And so, and then you see somewhere around, depending on how exactly you define the question, calls into 911. The vast majority of the calls are not violent, right? They're not violent crime. And so you have to ask the question, okay, when you get a call that's emergency, who should be responding to that, right? And we talked about mental health a lot. We talked about homelessness, and we're exploring models to divert that. And what is the appropriate response? Because one of the things that people don't think about is when you have the history of policing in this country, as I talked about, as a tool of state-sanctioned violence against certain people, particularly Black people. When police arrive, enhanced interactions with police for some communities are not welcome, right? Some communities don't want to have police interacting, and just their presence can escalate a situation. Just by a police officer showing up with a badge and a gun and with the authority vested to take life and or deprive someone of liberty, that we give them that power to keep us safe, to protect and serve, as was stated, that in and of itself can be seen as an escalation. And so we have to ask, I wrote an article a number of years ago saying, why Black men run from the police. And to understand the psyche of what we operate in, and I've said that in this country, the history of police violence and policing, it is not a unusual reaction for a person of color. Elijah talked about the talk that all Black families have with their Black children about how to interact with police. For you to want to get out of that situation, right, to remove yourself. And so I think part of what we have to talk about when we talk about reimagining, and I'm getting to your budget question, is what is the role of police? Should we be, there's a term in Montgomery County called proactive policing that the chief talks about and others talk about, of like, if you see something that you think is out of place, or actively going and checking things out, not just responding. That is something that we know in the context, for example, of New York with the stop and frisk policy. They're different, but they're related. In that if you stop, 1 million people, you're going to find some guns. But for the 90% of people who had no guns, their trust was eroded. They felt harmed and discriminated against. And similarly, if you're a young person of color in Montgomery County and you're standing outside of McDonald's, and this happened, and people come up to you and say, "What are you doing here?" Or if you're walking down the street and someone stops you and, takes your picture and asks you for your ID, that's not going to make you feel good about the interaction. And also, it's not leading to public safety. And so I think we want police focused on violent crime, which continues to go down in Montgomery County, not on this proactive policing, not on, broken windows light policing. And if you look at our numbers and statistics on stops, on who gets tickets, who gets arrested, as I mentioned, they are highly disproportionate. Trespass orders go down the list. And so I think there's an argument to be made that if we can shift mental health, homelessness, and stop that type of policing, that you can reallocate funding. I'd rather have a smaller, highly trained force that we do in other parts of the world that is focused on violent crime, and where we have services responding to other things, and we fully invest in education, we fully invest in after school, and we solve other problems at the same time. I think you can make an argument for reallocation again, but reallocation is not going to solve every problem. And I'll finally end with the SRO question, but I do think it's appropriate. We have one of the worst nurse to student ratios in the region. Delegate Qi, you're aware of this. Somewhere up of, we just added a few nurses, but at one point the number was like insane. It was over 1,000 students per nurse. Counselors similarly bad. Budgets are about decisions. And if I have to decide if I want a young child or a student interacting with a nurse or a counselor, someone who can help them with their needs versus a police officer in a school, as great as that person might be, they're not a counselor. They're not a nurse. They're not trained for those issues. I think that money is better well spent in the context of those types of needs for our students and families.
So are you saying we should shift the resources, $3 million, right? $3 million for the school resource officers program to increasing the number of nurses? Is that what you're saying?
I think we should remove the program, yes. And for two reasons. One, because it's a budgetary decision, but also because there's harm that comes from it. Over the last 4 years, half of the students that were arrested in schools were Black. I mentioned how just the presence of an officer can escalate a situation. They as nice as they could be, and I know many of our school resource officers, they're good people and they have good intentions. It's not their job to be a counselor. That's not what they're trained to do. They are trained to be law enforcement. And I think that is a decision that we should use that money and use those resources in a different way. And think about when we eventually do go back to school. This is the other thing, the harm. When some students come back to school, whenever that is, whether it's fall or the spring of next year, and they're seeing police officers, actually after everything that's happened in this country and in the world, that's going to create some trauma. And I think we have to factor that in too. And people haven't really talked about that. But I do think it's appropriate to reallocate it. And that's some of my colleagues and I are looking into doing that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the chief a couple of questions related to some tactics that have been called upon for reform by the community at large. I know recently, not long ago in Potomac, a young man was killed because the police executed a no-knock warrant, and that was similar to how Breonna Taylor died in her own bedroom. Would you like to comment on that? Because we got questions about this no-knock warrant, and when the council member is here, I also like him to chime in on that as well. Thank you.
So thank you, Delegate. Let me say I can't speak fully to the entire incident because it's still investigation by the Howard County State's Attorney's Office due to the fact it was an officer-involved shooting. But we released an extensive statement back in the spring about this particular case. This young man, Duncan Lemp, that was the target of the investigation, who was 20 years old, unfortunately, at the time of his death. Mr. Lemp had a background that prohibited him from having firearms. We had information that Mr. Lemp was part of an organization called a 3% Militia that is anti-government, and that individuals who believe in the right to have arms. We had information that Mr. Lemp had several high-powered illegal weapons in his residence at the time, and we also that Mr. Lemp slept with his gun as well. And we had information that a booby trap inside of his residence in order to harm anyone who came in his room in a certain way. So therefore, we had to fortunately come up with a plan when we do a no-knock search warrant, which was approved by a judge based upon the circumstances and the high risk of that case. And I will just share this part. We actually encountered Mr. Lemp early that morning. We ordered Mr. Lemp to put down, he had a weapon. He had a high-powered rifle pointed at the officer. The officer asked him to drop the weapon a couple of times. And Mr. Lemp refused to drop the weapon, so therefore he was shot and unfortunately killed. So that's what I'll share about the no-knock warrants. Out of the no-knock warrants that we have served, we have only over the past, really, we've been doing search warrants for quite some time in Montgomery County, utilizing our SWAT team. And most of the time in those types of situations, we only use our SWAT team. And we've only had 3 shootings over a long term of having SWAT teams. Mr. Limp is the only individual that we have actually, unfortunately, had to kill in this type of situation. So that's what I'll answer as it relates to that particular case.
Thank you very much. Council member, do you have, I know you have some policy initiatives that you introduced, and there was a law passed.
Yeah, well, I'll just mention it's not passed yet, but it passed out of committee. We
Okay.
one of the bills that I introduced along with council members Rice, Navarro, and Albornoz, and co-sponsored by the entire council, is a use of force bill that would direct the creation of a new use of force policy that would emphasize de-escalation, that would raise the standard of when deadly force can be used from reasonable to necessary, would codify a duty to intervene and protect officers who do when they witness another officer committing a crime or using excessive force, and it was amended to ban no-knock warrants, except in limited circumstances, in like hostage situations or when there's an immediate threat of a violent crime. Not using these for example, destruction of evidence, and that was included. It'll go to the full council next week. One of the things I'll say about these no-knock warrants is, obviously, we don't want anyone killed, officers or residents. And if you look at the data nationally on these, they're not safe for either person. But also, the trauma that happens that results from a no-knock warrant. Again, there's another case that's in litigation, so I won't comment deeply on it. But just think about someone knocking down your door at 4:30 in the morning, and other people that are there that aren't subject or party to the underlying warrant. And I think as a policy, we want to that's something we need to consider as well. And so, and I want to mention that use of force bill would raise the use of deadly force standard, would ban no-knock warrants, would ban striking individuals who are restrained, would ban chokeholds, and create that duty to intervene. And that is something that's working its way through. And that's one of the pieces on the accountability side that is really important in the use of force policy.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask both of you another question before I ask Elijah to comment on that together. One is, we got several questions related to 8 Can't Wait, which of course related to banning chokeholds, banning the shooting at the moving vehicles, and requiring officers to intervene and so forth. It's part of a comprehensive set of recommendations from a few years ago. So I want to ask, after the 2014 police shooting of Michael Brown of Ferguson, Missouri, President Obama created a task force on 21st century policing with dozens of recommendations. Particularly, people are calling for the urgency of reforming, called the 8 Can't Wait. So if I could start with the police chief, if you could comment on whether Montgomery County intends to adopt with urgency these reform measures. I know the state of Maryland is pressing on these as well.
So yes, so I'm more than happy to speak to them. So several of the 8 Can't Wait policies are already in place in Montgomery County. We had already banned chokeholds in Montgomery County, have done so since 2002. So that was nothing new to us. We already require de-escalation in our policy and in our training. We have highly emphasized that over the past few years. Duty to intervene, we put that policy in place just a little over a month ago, reached an agreement with the Fraternal Order of Police. We already have a ban at moving vehicles, and so that is in place. I think there's a couple of the issues with the 8 Can't Wait police reforms that police departments have failed to move towards, and one of them is the use of force, requiring a use of force continuum. And if you look at the use of force continuum, you are starting at the very bottom that the least amount of force that you would utilize, for example, so let's say you're going to a call for gunfire, and that would be shots fired. You go into the use of force continuum will require an officer to really start at the basics of use of force and try to increase the tools that is on his belt to the highest degree of use of force in order to resolve that. So if an individual is i.e. shooting, already in the process of shooting citizens, that means the officer would have to go through all of those particular options before they could actually pull the trigger. And we don't think that's feasible in those types of situations. What we do require in our use of force policy is for officers to be able to reasonably look at each situation in an objective way and to utilize the least amount of force possible in order to to stop the threat. And that's what I deem to be very important based upon the different circumstances in which we encounter. The other part is about requiring warning before shooting. It's the same. It would be under sort of the same example. That again, an individual who's already involved in a shooting, circumstances are always different. We do train our officers again in ways that we want our officers to give clear direction to individuals who might be armed before or in any way are potentially causing could cause injury to someone's to their personal body or to their life. So therefore, we are requiring our officers to make sure that they are there and announcing themselves in a way and giving the proper orders for those individuals to act. So it may not necessarily be to require warning before shooting, but we do focus on, again, trying to do what we can in order to have the least amount of force necessary. So many of these things we have adopted. We have adopted many of the Obama administration's the task force, their recommendations. We have put that in forth. We put a report out back in 2016 stating that. 2016, 2017, noting what are the recommendations that we put out and how we put those into place. So those things have been taken very seriously by my predecessor, Chief Tom Manger, and many of my fellow officers and executives that were in place at that time, because we thought that that was very important for our community to adopt those measures.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could comment, the details are really important here. Chokeholds actually were not banned. They were not trained, but there was an exception, and because we had about an hour, 30, 40-minute debate about this last week, and to decide whether to ban them in all circumstances, which is what we did. There was an exception if the officers, and there's a gaping hole in exception in most use of force policies now, where if the action is deemed reasonable and the officer thinks their life or someone's life is in danger, and that's a legal standard, reasonableness based on an objective officer, which is pretty broad. And you can look at the number of situations over the case law that have fallen into that category. It's very wide and very different. And so we added an amendment to ban chokeholds in every instance. So that, well, if this bill passes, that will be a new policy. So details, very important. Requiring de-escalation and using that language as deadly force can only be used when necessary, not reasonable, when necessary as a last resort, which is what the language of our bill says. That is a higher standard. And if you look at the staff report and the county attorney's interpretation of this standard, it is a higher standard, higher than the Supreme Court constitutional standard, which in Seattle, when they adopted a similar policy, the number of police-involved deaths went down. Exhausting other means before shooting, which is related to the continuum, use of force continuum. We want our officers charged to protect and serve us to exhaust all other options. That needs to be taught. We had a young man shot and killed, Fanon Burhay, one of the 3 African-American men since 2011 to be shot and killed in Montgomery County by police, who, as soon as a police officer arrived on scene, this man had a knife, was distressed, the gun was out, and there was yelling going on right away. And of course, that's a dangerous situation. But I think we could do a better job of really, really emphasizing the whole one. who should respond in the first place, and the type of the cahoots model in Portland, which we're looking at in other models, but then how we act and how we conduct ourselves as soon as we get there, as far as law enforcement. And so I think, the duty to intervene, that policy in large part was put into place because we had an officer convicted of assault, of kneeing an armed, a handcuffed suspect outside of an Aspen Hill McDonald's. That officer was charged and convicted of assault. There were officers standing around while that happened. No one intervened, and we had lengthy discussions with the council about need to put a policy like that in place. And so that it's great that that's in place, but that'll be codified. And similar with the banning the shooting vehicles, that was a policy in place that'll be codified. But I think it's important to dig into these details. If you look at the number one cause of death for police officers, it's suicide. If you look at three professions, sanitation workers, farmers, and police officers. Sanitation workers and farmers die on the job at a higher rate than police officers. That doesn't mean it's not a dangerous job. But this part of the problem I think we're facing is the mentality that, we need to have wide discretion. And I think we have to limit that discretion. And that's what they can't wait, many of which are in the bill that we put forward, are about. It's about how do we want our police to interact with us? That is a community-based decision. That should be dictated by the residents who give the power willingly to keep us safe. And I think when you have these types of incidences, we need to analyze that in a very critical way.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Elijah to comment on what you just have heard from our public officials. And you can also comment on how your group is advising the county executive's office on these policy initiatives.
Well, so thanks, Delegate. I think to the second question, there are many groups that are being assembled at this point in time around advocacy with the county executive on that. I think there are two specific groups that are being put together. One is a police advisory commission that I believe that a couple of the council members had the opportunity to appoint some folks, as well as citizens from the community as well, are currently interviewing, I believe, for roles on that commission right now as we speak. I believe there's also another advisory group that's doing some pre-work prior to that group, essentially on some local data that will help to inform that group around some of the work that they will be doing. So they specifically are charged with that. As in terms of our group, the African American Advisory Group, and some of these things, this conversation obviously is par for the course with us, whether it be with the county executive, in our own group internally and other folks. I think what we're talking about here when we're talking about defunding the police is we're talking about the unbundling of police work, right? What the councilman is calling for essentially at this point is the reduction of the potential for conflict between law enforcement and communities of color. That's all this is here, right? The less we have opportunities to put law enforcement in situations that they should not be in the first place, the greater the chances of there being less harm done. So, and I want to make sure that I also call out my co-chair, Dr. Cheryl Chapman, who I think has joined us here this evening, somewhere in the audience, for her work at Brown University with the CRISP group, where they've done a lot of studying around the work of social workers in conjunction with law enforcement, and actually dispatching social workers to the scene when someone calls law enforcement to address the needs of people there. I think at the end of the day, we have to look at this from the perspective of we're actually helping law enforcement out. We're taking them out of a situation that we know that they're already not comfortable with, that they don't want to spend their time on. We much rather have them out there looking at high crime issues, looking for violent criminals, and spending their time doing those things versus interacting with someone who's homeless or interacting with someone who has a mental health episode or issue or something like that. That's what we're talking about here. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think we're all in agreement about that. And I think it will actually lead to better relationships between law enforcement and community members. I think the less opportunity, once again, that you have for law enforcement to have to be put in a situation where normally we wouldn't call for someone to be in that situation, such as law enforcement, the better chances we have. At the end of the day, This is really about more effective community policing, making sure that we're advocating for resources being placed where they need to be in the first place, and then also getting down to the root causes of a lot of these issues. I heard the councilman speak earlier about broken windows policing. For those who don't understand that theory and how that leads to other issues, higher level issues, bringing law enforcement into communities unnecessarily, and some of these things too. So I think at the end of the day, if we do this the right way, what we will see is not only a reduction in some of these negative interactions between law enforcement and community citizens, but also better and more respectful relationships between the two communities as we speak.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump to next set of questions related to cultural competency, sensitivity toward different communities, and hiring and training. So I'm going to turn to our police chief. We received quite a few questions in that regard. For the purpose of our discussion, we looked into the demographics of our police department. It seems that 70.8% are Caucasian, 15.5% are African American, 8.6% are Hispanic, and 5.1% are others. I know, for example, it continues to be a huge challenge to recruit Asian American police officers. So here you can put in a plug. Hopefully we would all encourage our next generation at least to consider that as a viable career option. But let me turn to you for a few questions. What is being done to improve officer sensitivity toward different communities? And also we got a question that's related that says, how is policing approached in different communities? Is it standardized? Is it by different locations and communities?
Right. So first of all, our officers from a cultural competency standpoint go through a process of going through culture diversity training, where we try to highlight many of the communities in which they will be serving as they start out in recruit school, and it goes through while in their training while they are on a job. The one thing I've been teaching diversity since 2006. And even during the course of our putting those diversity classes together, we discovered that Montgomery County was so diverse that we had significant challenges to try to emphasize every community, but we really focused on, and when we talk about diversity, we talk more than just about race. We talk about religion, we talk about age, we talk about young people, we talk about our elders. There's a large variety of diversity in our community, and that has to be shared, sexuality, all of those things that are vitally important. So that's an ongoing education. I mean, as officers in the course of their careers, it is vitally important for us to be able to share that. One thing I'll put in a little bit of a plug here, Lily. I'll note that my upcoming class that is getting ready to start, our new academy class, session 71, they will be the first majority minority police class that we've had in the history of our department. So I feel good about where we are on track. But do I feel great about our numbers? No. The reality is that we look hard. We really are working hard to try to identify people who want to become police officers and serve in Montgomery County. And I think it's a great opportunity. But yes, we have challenges because we are in one of the areas that has really low unemployment. There are a lot of people who may not be looking at law enforcement as their first career. There are a lot of other things that are sometimes have a negative impact on individuals who want to become police officers. They don't become educated enough about what doesn't entail being a police officer. Police officers, we have a variety of jobs. I know a lot of what we focused on here today seems to be just talking about patrol officers, but there's a lot of officers who do a lot of fabulous things in many different functions and have been doing as an investigator. I know Mr. Jawanda talked about SROs, but I tell you, I've met some of the finest SROs who care about people. We talk about community partnerships, and you want to learn how to actually sort of have someone who wants to become a police officer. What greater place would it be when young people are now being able to be influenced by a police officer that they have a relationship at one of our schools in our community? And we've been able to actually really recruit cadets in our cadet program because of our SROs, because of that they met police officers that actually talk to them about a career in law enforcement. So as much as we sometimes get put into a bottle about exactly what we do each and every day, there's a wide variety of jobs that our officers do that are exciting, that are rewarding, and that is highly, again, there can be challenges, but I will tell you that there are some good outcomes when you are able to help people in many different ways. And it's more than just about helping them in crime, helping them deal with a particular situation that helps them resolve a problem that relates to public safety, getting their kids safely to school, on our roadways. There's a lot of things that we do outside of what people think that are done in the media. So again, those are some of our challenges, but we are always working towards more things around training as it relates to diversity.
Let me have you a follow-up question. What are you looking for in new hires? Because people's impression about the police department is like it's paramilitary almost, with a lot of machinery and guns and all of that. And now we are having this bigger conversation about reimagining police. What kind of professional background are you looking for as an ideal, or attributes or qualifications to join the police force? Because I read somewhere that Montgomery County Police Department, for example, has a lot of recruits who were former military retirees and so forth. Is this an area you're going to look to change as well?
So having people from the military, and again, I don't like to disrespect our military. Because we have some of the finest leaders in our country have come from the military. And so to just disrespect that and say that we wouldn't look at individuals who come from the military, because it's not about them having the skills of being able to handle weaponry or anything. That is not what we're looking for. First of all, we're looking for people who have integrity. And who are again, all of the things that we're talking about, who have the respect, who give respect, who have a good track record, who are honest people. That's who we're looking for. And then, in Montgomery County, we require you to have minimum of 60 college credits. A college degree is preferred, but even with a college degree, you can have a college degree in anything. I'm a business major. I did not come from the military. I basically had a degree in business management. And many of our officers actually are not necessarily they're coming from college. They may have criminal justice degrees. Many of our folks are lawyers. We have people who have a variety of talents in the computer field. And so there's a lot of different things that people bring to the table, and the different attributes is what makes us unique, because you don't want to bring people who just have one skill. We wouldn't want to bring just people from the military as one skill. In fact, again, we just a few years ago, because of recruiting, we really wanted to make sure that our officers, who are coming in from college, but that they had some experience. But the reality was we were having challenges even recruiting. So we did add having 3 years of military experience would be formidable in coming to this career. But again, when we look at that, we're looking for diverse. We have officers who speak a variety of different languages. That's what we're looking for. We are looking for folks who have some life experiences and working in unique areas. We always want to be able to recruit people from here in Montgomery County and in this region, but we know that there's multiple challenges in response to that. But I will say, I think over the past couple of years, we've been actually pleased to be able to see the caliber of people that we're actually that we're hiring.
Lily, could I comment briefly on that?
Yeah.
And this is because I think I'm glad you brought this question up. This is one of the major areas, when I wrote about where I think we need to have some serious change, hiring and how we evaluate people and the type of people we bring in and how they're trained. That's a big area. The middle was what we prioritize, and we talked a little bit about that, but not a lot. There's a issue in law enforcement around the country that I think we have here as well, as far as stats-driven policing, where you're trying to prioritize arrests and tickets, and whether it's implicit or explicit. I see Chief Jones shaking his head, but I've seen with my own eyes, I've seen boards of officers ranked by how many arrest tickets and things that they've issued. And there's a person at the top and there's a person at the bottom. And you can say, and I've seen PowerPoints where the one at the top is seen as the great officer and the one at the bottom is seen as the fat, lazy officer. So you can say it's not a part of the culture, but I've seen it and talked to officers about it. And it's not just Montgomery County. That's for federal government. When I worked on the Hill on the Judiciary Committee, the main grant that funds local departments gives you more money if you have more arrests. And so that's the second bucket. And then there's the accountability and transparency, which we spend a lot of time on, and the policies. But on the hiring side, I think there's a great opportunity in this reimagining moment to look at what we do. Montgomery County is, unlike a lot of police agencies across the country, the 18,000, does have a higher standard in that you need at least an associate's degree to become a police officer, and that's a good thing. There are places in the world, if you look at Germany or Denmark or Norway, where police officers go to school in a police academy setting for 2 to 3 years. Average police training is somewhere around 24 weeks. Some places it's less, some places it's a little more. I think Chief can correct me, I think we're around 24, 26. And I think there's an argument to be made to looking into different models for that. If you're going to require that associate's degree already, why don't we have people who are wanting to be a police officer right out of high school come in and take that 2 and 3 years and take their time and learn how to be a police officer and learn what's important as a baseline before they come and study something else at some other community college that might not be related, or at a 4-year institution. And I think that's a discussion we need to have. Psychological examinations is a big issue that we've been talking about and has been talked about for a while. There's one that's required at the end after an officer is offered a job. But if you go online and type police psychological examinations, you'll say it'll show you how to answer the questions right to get past it. And if you ask how many people are eliminated by a psychological examination, it's almost nobody. Almost everyone passes it. So you have to ask, is that the right way to train those things? And to look at that. And so I think there's a number of things in this area where we can look at that around the training and hiring side. And then the final thing I'll say, which I know the Chief and I will agree on, if at least this, that we should pay our police officers more. I was one of the few council members that I have high standards, but I also think you should pay people well. You want to demand stuff of teachers, you want to demand things of law enforcement, we rank 5 out of 6 in the region of the starting pay for police officers. That's unacceptable. And that's why they can't afford to live here. The many that don't. If you want to get to know the community, paying them enough, subsidizing housing so that people can have workforce housing and live here and interact with the community. Those are all things I'm very supportive of and that I think we need to do, as well as having high standards for our police officers.
Thank you. Well, because of the time issue, I'm just going to distill into one last 1.5 question. I will again start with the police chief because it's most relevant to your work, and then ask others to comment on that. And then I will acknowledge the people I want to thank and point out some resources for some takeaways. So my last question is related to accountability, which many of you have already touched upon. But we looked into the internal audits division's report from 2019. It looks like the internal audit division of MCPD received 270 complaints last year. And of these, 70 are formal, 70 of them led to formal investigations. So how can the county residents in general have access to such records or complaints? And more importantly, how can they initiate by filing complaints, by understanding how police works, and just have more active engagement with the police?
Sure. So those are our numbers from our internal affairs division. And so they look at the total numbers of complaints that come into the division. A formal complaint is a more serious complaint. There's a complaint that may be to the point of, it could be for example, would be an excessive force allegation. It could be, something of much more serious sexual harassment that might be internal. And there's some of those things are from the outside. Our not so serious cases that are informal are actually handled by our division directors, our commanders, who then make a determination on whether or not officers are in violation of policy. And so those are the allegations. So those records currently under the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights do not allow us to share the actual records of those particular cases. The individual that makes the complaint does have the ability to get the outcomes of those complaints. And we make sure that those individuals are provided with the outcomes, and we provide them with the information. Individuals who want to complain, who want to make a formal complaint, we have where you of course you can contact our Internal Affairs Division. That division works directly under my command, where I review all of our complaints and review the process in which those complaints are handled. But we also have, you can make complaints via, you can go online and we are working on getting an online form, but there's also an opportunity. We'll provide you with the form itself and make sure that you get a copy of it in order to mail that back to us or actually send it to us via email. There's other ways, such as some of our county office buildings, that you can have access to our complaints. But I know due to the fact that we're in the COVID crisis, many of that is limited for our folks. But again, you have the ability. There are many lines of opportunities to actually make a complaint. In that process, you will be contacted if a complaint is made in a short period of time after the complaint is received.
Thank you, Chief. I actually forgot that the half question is related to accountability for all the things you want to do. Do you think, we got several questions on that one, so I need to ask, do you think that the police union is on board to support your reform efforts or any new initiatives?
So I think in some cases they have been on board, but I will tell you that I think one of the things that the union, our union in the collective bargaining agreement, one of the things that I think has been a barrier for police accountability here in Montgomery County is the option of officers utilizing an alternative hearing board, which is led by a neutral arbitrator who can then take my recommendation. For example, if I want to have an officer dismissed from the department because I think of that officer's bad behavior, that neutral arbitrator and the panel that he sits on leads can override my opinion. So I think I would like to see that switched. I know the union does not want to see that because that's an option that they've been able to bargain over the past so many years, and they don't want to give that up. But I think that there is a traditional hearing board. I think a fair process that still is in place. But then I think that any chief of police should have the final authority on a person's employment that works for his or her agency.
Thank you so much. I know we are come up against the time, but I want to quickly summarize. I know Council Member Jawanda needed to leave on time, and I'm very grateful for all the insights and information he has shared. I have learned a lot. This has been highly educational. There's never enough time to delve into these deep conversations. But I hope our conversations will continue at different levels, maybe focus on different aspects of these bigger conversations. I do want to point out that the Emery Grove Rotary Club is actually represented by its president, Yvette Goss, who is also on the call tonight. So I want to thank her for her leadership and co-sponsorship. And I think Dr. Cheryl Brissett Chapman, the co-chair, another co-chair with Elijah, could also be on the call. I think she was also on the call. So I want to thank them as well. And I want to just give everyone 10 seconds if you have some speakers, if you have some last minute thoughts and reflections on tonight's program. Julianne, why don't we start with you? Thank you so much for helping me organize this.
Absolutely. Thank you to everyone who played a role in getting this together. We had over 100 participants, which I think was a great turnout. Just really quick, just wanted to say I would be remiss if I didn't give a plug for our office and our census efforts. August the 7th is Census Day, and enumerators will be knocking on doors on August the 11th. So in order to avoid door knockers on the 11th, please make sure that people in our community fill in their forms. Thank you very much.
Great plug. Thank you so much. All right. Paul, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you very much. It's been very informative, and there are a lot of the complexity in the issues involved, and I really appreciate it. It's been very educational to me personally. Thanks.
Thank you. Elijah.
Just two things real quick. I want to thank you all, obviously, our Asian and American brothers and sisters for sponsoring this in conjunction with us this evening, having this rich discussion. And I do want to make sure that we close with this. Chief Jones is in an unenviable position right now. When we start talking about accountability and some of these other things, there's the Maryland Officers' Bill of Rights that predates him, that I believe was the first of its kind in the country back in the early 70s, that really kind of cripples some of these local things that he wants to do to a certain extent. So I think we need to be mindful of all those kinds of things. Last thing, Delegate, you talked about accountability. We got to pay our officers more, like Councilman Jawanda said. There's no accountability like accountability at home. When a law enforcement officer lives in the community or is able to live in the community with the folks that he actually works alongside with in the community that he patrols day in, day out, it changes the relationship. So we really need to start thinking about what we have to do to subsidize their housing and some of these other things. For the fire department, law enforcement, teachers, all these folks out here doing really important work. But thank you all. Appreciate the conversation. Looking forward to more conversations and interactions with everyone. Thank you. And Ariane?
I just wanted to say there was a statistic where police officers that were surveyed, 20% of them reported that they were under mental health stress. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of the officers, they go out on the street and they may lose their life that day. The Supreme Court also sanctions them to use serious force whenever they can reasonably fear for their safety. So these conversations about delegating out to mental health professionals are timely and relevant and help the police as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And I want to take a moment to particularly thank Chief Jones for your stellar public service. I know it's really challenging to be a police officer even during normal circumstances, especially a police chief. I personally have had great experience interacting with Montgomery County Police, which was my colleague department. But I have also heard from other people, including friends and people I'm very close to, some complaints about some interactions. So I think there is definitely room for improvement. So very much appreciate your leadership and willingness to reach out and connect with all communities, which is the richness of Montgomery County today. So I just want to thank all the sponsors and the planners with me and the community partners for all of your efforts and all of your service to our communities. Thank you again. And we have resources posted in the chat boxes, and I think this session is recorded so that you can revisit if you missed a certain information. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.